Welcome everyone to our last session in the afternoon of this conference, Zoom conference, which is taking place in Washington, D.C., sponsored by PSO and others. In our panel today on gender and the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have two excellent presenters. The first I'll introduce now is Adina Friedman. We're talking about gender, religion, and politics in Israel. She's a PhD from George Mason University. She specialized in conflict analysis and resolution. She's the director of a foundation which has initiatives which allows students to do internships in the Middle East and North Africa, which she may also mention and talk about. Etc. She's also an adjunct professor at George Mason University, at GWU, and at American University. We'll now hear from Adina, who will introduce her
topic. Okay, good afternoon. I just think that you mixed up our titles.
Okay.
In any case, I'll clarify. Let me just share my screen here. Titles, I mean, of the presentation. Okay, so today I will talk a little bit about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace process or relationship through a gendered lens or gender lens. So first of all, what do we mean by gender hierarchies? How does this relate to conflict? And why is it important in peace building? Are questions I'll try to answer. Oh my goodness, wait. Okay, so gender, first of all, is, I'll read here what you can read too, a socially constructed category. It's not the same as sex, not the same as women. That's important for this, in this case, not the same as women. Everybody has a gender. It's a category of power and privilege that's cross-cutting. So there are a lot of categories of power and privilege, but gender exists everywhere. It's a range and it's hierarchical, which means it's a range like this. Let's say, I don't remember which is which, masculinity is on the right and femininity is on the left. So it's basically not just looking at men and women, it's looking at a range of gender identities or gender expressions, with masculinity seen as being epitomized or embodied by a man and femininity by a woman, but it doesn't have to be the case. So it's really like this. And this is important because it shows what we value in our world, primarily and definitely in the Middle East, including Israel. Masculine traits we attribute to masculinity, or to which we attribute masculinity, are much more highly valued than femininity, and that has an effect on everything. So if you look at the common denominator in these wonderful pictures from different peace talks and events, you can count the number of women you see here. I can tell you there are two. One sitting here and one standing in the back who's, I don't know who she is, but she's probably in a supporting role. So, however, we'll look a little bit at the representation of women, but as I said, that's not the only, or even, maybe not even the main issue. So we'll see how that works. So here's a quote that's important for the framing of what I will be talking about. Our first the authors of this book, their first proposition is that it is inappropriate to study social issues, including conflict, without considering the impact of gender. This is because gender is one factor that pervades all aspects and levels of conflict. It carries expectations for conflict behavior and for rights and responsibilities in conflict negotiations. As such, it connects social context to specific conflicts while influencing conflict processes directly. But the pervasiveness of gender makes its influence, like the air we breathe, too often unseen. So in other words, we tend to look at a lot of things as gender neutral when in fact they're not gender neutral. I would say that practically nothing is gender neutral. It becomes a kind of subtext and buried premise for a lot of other things that we do, or assumptions we have, behaviors we have. And that invisibility is nowhere more important than in the paradigms of Western science, or on which Western science and philosophy are based. And that they also have to do with the paradigms and theories we use in conflict resolution and peace building and negotiations and a bunch of other things. Okay, so again, when we show the gendered nature, when we put on gender lenses, we can see how conflict has been shaped by gender assumptions, concepts, and practices and institutions, and understand that it's not, that it matters and it's not a gender neutral something, entity or idea. Again, gender affects how we see, how we organize the world, how we understand social life, social structures and beliefs. And it also is responsible for the way we process information about the world. So it affects how we communicate with one another, what we believe is true, how we make sense of the world is also affected by gender. It's gendered. In the Israeli-Palestinian case, and my examples will be a little bit heavier on the Israeli side because I'm Israeli, because I know a little better there, but they'll be both. So women have been involved always, but more so since the 80s, since the Lebanon War, or the first Lebanon War in 82, where women became, or a number of women's groups became more vocal against the war and then against occupation. And then there was there in the Intifada and the Palestinian side and throughout, not just in the first and second Intifadas, but throughout, women have been on the forefront, not necessarily of always peace talks. So for example, what you see on the left is not peace talks, but it could be seen as a struggle for what Palestinians would see as peace or for some kind of justice, whatever. Women are on the forefront. They've always been active, more so in recent decades, or it's already been 4 decades. In the Madrid process in 91, there were 3 Palestinian women on the delegation, which was a joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation. And that's the largest female delegation representation there was on any delegation. But after that, even though women had become, had kind of occupied niches that had previously been occupied by men during the Intifada on the Palestinian side, they were pushed to a large extent, pushed back into their places afterwards. And when there were peace talks, really, even though they were at the table, some men made agreements behind closed doors and excluded those women. So it was back to business as usual. And this is despite the fact that women were actually much more connected to the ground. They understood the grassroots. That's where they worked. They had worked. They were connected to the community, but the ultimate accords and all of their corollaries were really negotiated by men, excluding women from all dimensions of the process. Okay, another landmark is UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in 2000 regarding the importance of having women present at peace negotiations and recognizing their contribution and in a number of different ways. This was on the one hand a groundbreaking decision, on the other hand, it had some shortcomings. One of them was, so as we will see in a minute, gender is not just about women and having women at the table. That's just one part of it. And even when we have women at the table, it's not just women, in addition to the men who are already there. And it's not just a few token women, because that doesn't make the difference. We'll see that sometimes even reifies the existing structures. So the claim that some feminists or some activists made regarding this decision, this resolution, was that it's a little too superficial, and that actually by being that superficial, it's reinforcing the existing gender frameworks and hierarchies that already exist in the international arena. So the international arena is also not gender neutral. Relationships between states can be seen as on a gender hierarchy. Countries are masculinized or feminized according to all kind of criteria. Like I said, different traits are masculinized or feminized, and the ones that are masculinized are the ones more desirable. So for example, authority, competitiveness, rationality, restraint, and sometimes even force, physical force, continue to be held in the same esteem. It's just that now we said we have to have women at the table. even though this was a resolution that a lot of countries had agreed to or signed on to, not all countries or most countries didn't implement it as much as they should have. One example, so in 2004, the Knesset wrote a report about this, and it passed some legislation about the equality of women's rights, which was actually advanced compared to some other countries. However, so anyway, and it recognized women's contributions, but at the same time, you had other things happening that were, we'll get to that in a second. Anyway, at the time you had Tzipi Livni, who became the second Israeli woman to be, or the woman in Israel to be a foreign minister after Golda Meir being the first. You had her saying already in the beginning that having women at the peace talks should not be just a gesture. It's not a token thing, but it really is in Israel's national interest. And it's women's right to be there as well, in all places where decisions are made. I'll reiterate that soon. On the Palestinian side, one of the main players was Hanan Ashrawi, who also, among other things, established Miftah, is an NGO she founded. And in one interview here, she's talking about how she had discussions with Abu Mazen, and she got him to accept the resolution and agree to incorporate women into the legislative body, and also to add women. He agreed in principle, but yeah, he agreed in principle, and a little bit of movement was made, but we're not sure. It didn't reach the extent that it was intended, or that women wanted it to reach. Also in 2010, that same NGO put together a list of recommendations of what on the Palestinian side should be done with regard to women. And it talks about giving them a voice, having them included in negotiations, ensuring no less than 30% of direct participation is by women in all peace process dimensions, etc. Tzipi Livni became initially foreign minister and also minister of justice in 2005, but eventually also became, and in 2006 rather, and eventually also became prime minister for a while. She's only the second woman, as I said, to have this post of foreign minister, which again shows you that even though Israel was advanced by having a woman prime minister, that really meant nothing regarding gender equality as a whole. This is another quote from somewhere. I have all the resources at the end if anybody wants where I've taken these from. Anyway, another argument is about whether or not women who come to the table need to be the ones representing feminist discourse, or not necessarily. And so Livni had some opinions about this. For example, she came not as a feminist necessarily initially. She came just to advance peace talks, and she happened to be a woman as well. But I think she became a little more cognizant of her role on gender issues eventually. Let's see where let me just see where. Okay, so here she says, there's a twisted logic which says defense issues belong to men, but decision-making is actually connected to the ability of a person to analyze and look ahead, to ask questions, etc. And no man, including any general, has an advantage over me in this process. I went into politics because of my involvement in diplomacy and regional issues. Women's rights were not my driving force, but I did act to increase the level of representation of women on the boards of different companies, etc., in her previous capacities. Ashrawi was once asked about collaborating with, I'm giving these because there are very few women I can actually give examples of. So she was asked about collaborating with Livni, and she said, I understand she has an added burden and more challenges. I know what it means to be a female in an exclusively male club where the attacks can be very vicious. and attempts at delegitimization, etc. I know what she is facing, but I also know that to succeed, you must not adopt the current or prevailing male ethos or attitude or politics of power and intimidation. If a woman is to succeed, she has to bring her gender with her. Attempting to be a watered down version of the male politician won't get you anywhere. She must be true to her gender. So this is a little bit more of what the point I'm trying to make is that it's not enough. Two things. One is that it's not enough to have just women at the table. We'll see that in a minute again. Okay, so first of all, we don't know that if more women had been at the table, it necessarily would have been a success story. We know that it hasn't been every time only men have been at the table. So, and again, there are different studies that show, this is just one mentioned here, but there are many, or there are a number, studies that look at 40 peace processes in 35 countries since the 90s and show that when women are involved significantly, there's more chance of reaching an agreement. It's more sustainable most of the time, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many benefits of women being involved. We'll ask if that even needs to be a question. So here again, Oslo process failed for many reasons, but the fact that 50% of the stakeholders did not participate or were excluded didn't help. And it's actually more than 50% more or less of women, but there are other groups of marginalized men who also didn't participate, weren't included. Okay, so back to one of my main points before, there's a tendency to count how many women are at the table, but that in and of itself does not say anything about the influence, about gender equality, or about the influence those women have. Women can be at the table and be absolutely sidelined in the process, or if they're, just a couple of them, there needs to be some kind of critical mass to be more influential. But even when there are more women, they could still be sidelined in some places. It's happened. Okay, so there are theories about broadening participation, so having more women participate in many more ways than just at the negotiation table. However, it doesn't mean that we should be, and this is what happens oftentimes, that women are looked at as, okay, they should be in peace negotiations, which are often viewed from a narrow lens of post-conflict. There's violent conflict and there's peace negotiations to get a ceasefire and some kind of written agreement. But peace building is much broader than that. And women should be included at all levels of decision-making because they're human beings who are members of society and their voices should be heard, not just because when they do, it's beneficial to everybody, but also because that's the way it should be, especially for societies who espouse to be democratic and participatory. They shouldn't be only in all the second, third, fifth, 10th tier working on picking up the pieces or working on the grassroots, which is not a bad thing to do, but they should also be on the decision-making table. So these are some perspectives from Livni and from Zahira Kamal about women being essential to the peace talks. But again, our societies, these peace talks happen in a context. Our societies, I'll talk about Israeli, but it's also Palestinian and also pretty much any other society in the MENA region, are very gendered / with an ethos that's very masculine. That's thanks to militarism in a lot of places, but in Israel, for example, the IDF, service in the IDF being a rite of passage, militaristic surroundings all around us, language, it's embedded in our language without thinking about it, in our frames of thought. There are different networks that people, mostly men, but maybe more women these days than before, create networks that help them throughout life with jobs and other things. So it's an exclusive club in some ways of some people. And there's this reverence to the military. There's also patriarchy, chauvinism, religion, and other things that enforce this masculine masculinized society, which is a big issue. When we talk about gender, I'm almost finished. How much longer do I have?
You have about 2 more minutes.
Okay, so I'm finishing. So gender really doesn't mean just men and women. It means inclusivity in general. And inclusive means inclusive. There are people who have different gender identities. There are many different kinds of women and many different kinds of men. And all those voices should be part of the decision-making process. That should be reflected somehow. You can't have a process that is one way, that is exclusive, and then expect to have an inclusive reality after the fact. Here are just some more recent pictures of agreements reached now between Israel and some of its new friends, new old friends. And it doesn't matter if it's the previous, some of it is the previous administration, it's the same kind of picture. It still remains not only the gendered premises in all these societies, but also the fact that it's mostly men making deals. It's not always the way that interests are defined, are not always everybody's interests, and meaning everybody in their own societies. And therefore, even these wonderful new peace agreements should be, we should be keeping an eye on them and take them with a grain of salt, because when you take a bunch of dictators of different kinds making peace deals, we should be a little cautious. It's not good enough. We need a lot more than that. So again, just to emphasize that women are important, but we have to make them count and not just count how many of them there are. And there could be men who espouse the same ideals as those women, and there could be women who don't. So it's really including different voices of all kinds and different people of all kinds to make the process representative, which would make it much more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Adina. We now turn to our second speaker, Ilan Fuchs, who's a legal scholar. I guess his expertise is really in international law. He's a product of Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He's had a research association with the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, and one of their projects on gender, culture, religion, and law. His presentation today will be The Disappearance of Religious Socialism in Israel, a Comparative Perspective.
Thank you so much, Fred. First of all, thank you for once again, this yearly conference. This is the second year we're doing it on Zoom, and hopefully next year we'll go back to normal. And so thank you for the Institute. This project, which I'm about to talk about, is a part of it actually began in Hadassah Brandeis Institute, where I was working on an article that dealt with the heir apparent to the leadership of the Besiakov movement in interwar Poland. This article turned into a book project when I discovered he was actually a socialist thinker. And that gave room for a book project, which will hopefully be done in the next few months, which I'm doing at American Public University, where I'm a professor in the legal studies program. And this book deals with the spectrum of religious interpretations of socialism in the interwar period. It focuses on two groups. One is Agudat Israel in Poland, and one is Dat Ve'Avoda, which was an offshoot of this movement, which turned into Zionism. It was an offshoot of both Hapoel Mizrahi and Agudat Israel. And in the book, I deal extensively with the ideological background of these movements and how they interpreted socialism from a religious perspective. But I don't want to talk about the political ideology of these movements. That will take too much time. I want to focus on my last chapter, which is an analytical chapter, which tries to answer a very intriguing question. Where did they go? Why is it that after the war, after the Holocaust, these groups, this political narrative of the religious left, of religious socialists, totally disappeared? If the Zionist movement was dominated for most of the 20th century by the labor movement, would you expect to see, if for no other reason than political expediency, also a representation of the religious left? Something. This is an interesting question, which definitely pushes the boundaries of my set of skills as an historian and as a scholar of law. But I think it's very important because without talking about this, it's very hard to evaluate the importance of this phenomenon. So let's begin with perhaps what I think is the first place to begin. The limited scholarship on movements like this sees this kind of religious politics as a form of apologetics. This is by no means anything new. It's a common explanation among scholars. This is apologetics. And in the case of the movements I mentioned, existing scholarship has always deemed them as simply a ploy by the Orthodox establishment as making sure votes in Poland and later on in Israel will not gravitate towards the left. It was simply a way to keep religious proletariat vote within the camp. Now, basically saying these are not real socialists. I'm not going to get into the details because we do not have time. I will just say this. This view is quite outdated in the sense that to judge realpolitik, socialist realpolitik, from the very rigid prism of political ideology, in other words, to superimpose Marxian texts on religious politics, on realpolitik, is at best problematic. Perhaps Marx himself was not a Marxist. There is a gap between the political ideological texts that are written in the post-confinement of political philosophy and the world of realpolitik. And within socialist narrative, there is a spectrum. Now, Marx himself deemed what he dubbed utopian socialists as not real socialists. This is common knowledge. When Marx talked about utopian socialists, was thinking about the Fabians and others. He said these people are not real socialists because for him socialism is not about spirituality; it's about science. It is a historical process, a scientific progress of technology that brings about economic changes. The utopian language of utopian socialists was that socialism is a spiritual quest, and it is necessary for human evolution, and he rejected that through and through. Now, the religious thinkers I read about, and again, we don't have time to get into what they're saying, because it's not really our topic, was that indeed there is a religious requirement for socialism. In other words, the religious goals of redemption require socialism. Just to quote the key figure in my book, the person that laid the foundation for this discourse of religious socialism, Yehuda Leibov, he said the entirety of the cosmos symbolizes order. Our holy Torah, however, charts the course towards order. In other words, this idea, the Marxist idea of the development of history is a religious requirement. It is the way in which the religious envisage of the redemption will be achieved. Now, he himself was not a member of any socialist organization or communist organization. Why? Because he rejected the violence of Marxism. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, but the important thing is this is not unique. To dub him as an apologetic, you could say the same thing on many, and here's where the comparative element comes into view. Many of the socialists, many of the Christian socialists that emerged in Britain in the 19th and 20th century. Just to mention a few, people like William Morris, Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier. Even in Saint-Simon and Fourier are not Christian socialists, but they are definitely utopian. William Morris, while had a complicated relationship with Christianity, explained his interest in socialism as a spiritual quest. And there are many others. Now, if you want to dub all of them as apologetics, you can say about Olean. But if you want to say that this group, all these Christian socialists are not apologetic, but they're actually political activists interested in the formulation of socialism alongside their religious activities, and there's a vast array of literature about this. If we look at Britain in the 19th and 20th century, all the literature about the Christian socialism and peaking in the 1920s with Richard Tawney. In the United States, the Catholic worker movement with Peter Moore and Dorothy Day, beginning in the interwar period. And to a degree, the Niebuhr brothers, of course, in the Protestant world. Unless we want to, and of course, liberation theology in the 1960s. So unless you want to say all of them are apologetics, which I don't think anybody will say, the Jewish examples should be seen also in that aspect. Yes, they want to make sure the voters don't go to the anti-religious parties, but it doesn't mean that their interest in socialism is not real and not genuine. And in the first chapters, I deal with that, with those examples. So after we move that out of the way, after we are all in agreement that this is not simply a ploy, this is not simply a political ploy, that this is a coherent view of socialism, why is it that they couldn't find room to collaborate with the mainstream left? So let's begin with something, again, that was very important to me to inspect also from a comparative perspective. All the religious thinkers which I dealt with in the book, Olean and his disciples, did the same thing that the Christian left did in the 19th century and 20th century. The rejection of the main problem with the Marxist narrative was violence, and which makes perfect sense, because the religious language which they used to promote socialism talked about the duty of the community of faith to all its members and the religious sin of economic exploitation. Now, when you do that, when you use that kind of language, and when you necessitate it by biblical verses that talk about loving thy brother, it is very hard, perhaps impossible, to justify the use of violence, which is so integral to the Marxian text. So the Marxist infatuation with violence, the legitimacy which Marxist discourse gives to the use of violence in the revolution, was a major stumbling block for religious left. And this is not true. Again, this is not limited to Judaism. It's also true for Christianity, for Christian socialism. Now, so should we explain the disappearance of the religious left by this point? I don't think so. I don't think that can explain everything. It explains the difficulty. It explains the maybe some of the gap. But we need to remember that socialism also evolved, and again, Marx was not stagnant. What do I mean by that? The socialist narrative also changed about violence. If we look at the socialist discourse, even around Marx, again, the Fabians, even Marx's daughter, Eleanor, who worked so closely with William Morris, they tweaked the concept of the revolution. So, and again, if we look at the specific context of the Zionist left, of the labor movement within Zionism, from Bohov and definitely Ben Gurion and afterwards, there was also no use of violence because, again, who was dominating the Yishuv from its inception? Labor Zionism. The Yishuv is created in the image of labor Zionism, so there's no need for to overthrow anyone. There's definitely talk about political progress and historical evolution, a la Marx, but violence was not part of that discourse. So this rejection of violence, again, while explaining the difficulty in the interwar period, doesn't explain why after the war, the religious left disappears. And again, not only in the Jewish context, it's also true for outside Israel. Now, I mentioned, just as an example, to maybe solidify this concept. When we talk about liberation theology in the 1960s, maybe the prime example, one of the most important figures in that space was Camilo Torres, the famous Colombian priest, ideologue, very prolific writer, who captured the imagination of the Colombian left, was at the center of the attempt to unify the left, and many would argue the precursor of liberation theology that emerged soon after his death. Torres was politically active. The church hierarchy was very uncomfortable with his political activity, and they made it a point to remove him and take away his faculties, his ability to perform his religious duties as a priest. But he himself did not see himself as resigned from the church until he came to the realization that he cannot further his political agenda without violence. When his text, he talks about he rejects his removal from the church by the hierarchy, but he himself doesn't see himself removed from the church until he makes the conscious decision to join the violent struggle. Only when Torres joins violence and uses violence and joins the revolutionaries in guerrilla warfare, and dies in battle, by the way, while holding arms and shooting at other people, only then he sees himself as removed from the church, because he says, I cannot reconcile my political beliefs and the need for justice, political justice, with a religious language which cannot justify the use of violence. Now, does this explain everything? Again, as I said, socialist narratives is much more complex. This rejection of violence does not explain everything. Explain something in the 1920s and 1930s, but definitely not post-war. So now, I would like to make my suggestion. Fred, how much time do I have?
Yeah, you have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay.
8 minutes.
Okay, exactly where I wanted to be. Okay, so here's where I like to make my suggestion. I'd like to say two things. I think we need to change the perspective. In other words, the disappearance of the religious left is not we don't need to look for the reason so much among religious voters. We should look for it in the political leadership of the Israeli left. Now, what do I mean by that? First of all, when we talk about socialist narratives, including the ideological agenda, ideological legacy that is at the foundation of the Israeli left, it's a very complex legacy, and it's also very rich. Bochum, Ben Gurion, and others, when they approached their politics, they came with a very deep understanding and knowledge of the political literature of Marx and what preceded him and what came after him. So when we look at socialist narratives on religion, we need to begin with Feuerbach, with Bruno Bauer, which again laid the foundation for this Marxist critique of religion. We of course have to be aware of Marx and Engels in defining religion as a source of alienation, as a political tool, and as a phenomenon at the center of the superstructure, and therefore central tool in the hands of capitalists to construct false consciousness. Now, with that in mind, with all that legacy, the labor Zionist movement, not surprisingly, again, not unique, this is definitely not unique to labor Zionism, thought after the war that religion is a phenomenon that will disappear. In other words, the expectation was that religion as any kind of a social norm will be limited to reservations because of the advancement of science, coupled with the fact that nationalism will replace the political need of religion. Again, very basic reading of Marx, very basic reading. Now, discussing this, it's not a big surprise that they thought it's not something worthwhile spending time on. But there's a little bit more than that. Now, someone can push back easily and say, let's look at religious politics in the modern period. Now, if I go to Ezra Mendelsohn, Elileden Handler, but mainly Ezra Mendelsohn in their work on modern Jewish politics, one of the very interesting things that Mendelsohn talked about in his work was the fact that modern Jewish politics is this movement from the Mal of the Shtadlan, the medieval Shtadlan, the emissary of the Jewish community that represents the Jewish community to the non-Jewish authorities, and therefore is limited to a political language of interests, a very limited language. That movement towards modern politics skips, according to so many people, so many scholars, skips religious politics. In other words, if you read Gershon Bakun and Agudat Israel and many other scholars, rightfully so, they talk about religious parties in the Zionist context as shtadlanim for a reason, because they did promote, to a large degree, the narrow interest of the Orthodox community in what they saw as the ruling class, the ruling power, labor Zionism. But I think everybody would agree that this is, while an aspect of religious politics, it's not the only aspect. And definitely with the religious language, the political language of Orthodoxy allows for a much broader, a much more sophisticated, and a much more broad discourse about big political questions. And best example would be the national religious political involvement post 1967. Definitely not narrow not only interested in narrow community interest. Now, it's also true about religious left. There are examples of a nucleus of a religious left potential in Israeli politics. The two best examples are Netivot Shalom and its political byproduct, Meimad, which in the 1990s became Netivot Shalom, was a religious group supporting, mainly dominated by academics from Hebrew University, focused on creating religious language, supporting the peace process and political compromise and territorial compromise of Palestinians. That morphed into Meimad, which was a political party in the 1990s, which at a certain point ran with the labor movement and actually had political representation in the Israeli parliament. It was short-lived, but I don't think that's the point. The point is that there is definitely a nucleus there for a religious left political discourse. Now, I think I have 5 minutes left. So in those 5 minutes, I would say this. So my explanation is that the feasibility of religious left, that again, is clear. It's clear with the examples I deal with. It's clear from the short-lived experience of Meimad. What I think it means, so this should shift the focus towards the discourse within the left about religion. The legacy of the left vis-a-vis religion, the very complex critique of religion, again, that has a lot of baggage, limits the ability of religious voters, or pushes away religious voters. Now, again, that's not a new point. There's a lot of comparative scholarship about it when it comes to Europe, when it comes to the United States. In the United States, maybe a prime example people discuss the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is the political home base of Bernie Sanders, has a religious wing to it. But one of the things that are evident is that the religious base is obviously situated politically in a very different place. Why? Because the religious political language comes with certain goals and certain agenda, and the political language of the left at this point, being again also very broad, gives very little room for a political compromise on that issue. Now, in the Israeli context, and in the context of the Israeli peace process, I would venture to say that the demographic work that has been done about Israeli society and the demographic predictions of the makeup of Israeli society in the future, as much as we can rely on demographics, necessitate the left to reevaluate, to one degree or another, its language towards religion, because the importance of religious voters and their growing, their constant growth within the Israeli political spectrum mandates that without getting some of that religious voting bloc, the left has a very, very minimal, has limited chances of regaining serious political power in the Israeli political map. Let me just summarize and say this. This book shows two very clear things. First, it shows that political discourse within Orthodoxy in the interwar period was not homogeneous by any stretch of the imagination. And that the political model that was created for religious politics after the war that was homogeneous created an imagined past, and that Orthodox politics in the interwar period was much more sophisticated and much more diverse than what happened after the war. It also shows that within religious language, within Orthodox religious language, there is room for a political spectrum which is quite wide. And the clear alignment of the religious voters with the Israeli right is not is not necessarily the only political future when it comes to the Israeli political map. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both speakers. And I think we'll begin with the questions. I'm going to ask two questions, one of each speaker, and then you can each respond. And after that, if we have other questions and we have time, then we'll take some more. Adina, I wanted to ask you a question about Ashrawi. You talk about your whole focus is on gender and the importance of gender and the absence of women in the peace process, etc. But if you take Hanan Ashrawi as an example, what's most significant in terms of her identity? Her gender or her religion? The fact that she's a Christian might be much more significant than the fact she's a woman. Now, the other question I have for you is, why do you assume, can you explain the basis of assuming that women want peace more than men? What's the inclination of women towards peace? If I take the Israeli example, I can take the settlement movement, Greater Israel. There are many significant women. We shouldn't forget Daniela Weiss and many, many other people. They're women, and they're radical and they're extreme, and like I say, they hate Palestinians or whatever. Israel should be for the Jews, etc. So if they ran the peace talks, I don't think there'd be peace talks. We'd just be getting everyone else out of the country. Ilan, and those are two questions for you. And Ilan, I found your talk very, very interesting. I found the second part more interesting than the first. What it seems to me is, and this is almost a little bit of a critique, I think when you talk about the Israeli left or the religious left in Israel, I think at a certain point in time, they lost touch with socialism. I mean, it just disappears. You know, sometimes by word of mouth, they continue to talk about the socialist ideals and the influence of Marx and all of that. But I think all of that was gone by the 70s. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration. Now, my question is, and maybe you did answer it, maybe I just missed it. I think you did say something when you talk about the base, the Orthodox base, the religious base. But who rejects the religious left? Is it the secular left or is it the religious leadership?
Should I go ahead? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for the questions. So first of all, your first question relates to the point I was trying to make very briefly at the end, but it's a very important point about inclusiveness in general, like much broader than men and women, plus the concept of intersectionality, which I think I skimmed through, but it's critical. So when I come to the table, for whatever reason, I'm not just a woman. I'm Jewish, I'm Israeli, I'm a woman, I'm an academic, and I'm everything else. And the same goes for anyone else. So there's absolutely no reason anyone would have to choose. And actually, there was another quote there that I didn't stop to read, but it was exactly about that, about women not having to, they shouldn't have to choose between one thing or another. They bring whoever they are to the table. And they, among other things, are women, but that's not the only thing. Like I said, there are a lot of different identities and identities and forms of marginalization, etc. And they're all important and different. Oh, what I wanted to say, there are a lot of different forms of privilege, gender being cross-cutting, but it's not the only one. That's one. And the second point is that, first of all, yes, I had the privilege of meeting Daniela Weiss and being with her on a news item once upon a time. So I know she doesn't like Arabs. But she and many other women, that relates to the bigger argument, which is, hang on one second. Why don't you know what? Why don't you, Ilan, go answer that and I'll get back to you. I'll stop the noise in the background, okay? Unless you don't hear the noise. Do you hear the noise in the background?
We don't hear the noise.
Okay, so never mind. So I'll go ahead. So I'll continue. Just 1 second. Yeah. 1 second. Hold on. Go ahead. Neighbors outside. Okay, so the second question is critical because it's exactly not about just women or just men, because you can have men who think differently and you can have women who think like men, so to speak. So it's about, but the thing is, for example, there have been studies about how women and men negotiate. And you can't really have those studies just looking at different behaviors of men and women, because we're all acting within given frameworks which are gendered and in which masculinities are more highly valued. So we're all men, women, and everything in between, we're all conditioned within the same kinds of frameworks. And so, and especially if I were on my own, like one woman among, I don't know, 50 men, it would be very unlikely that I could bring you're signaling to me?
Yeah, I think you're going to just have to finish up in the next sentence.
Okay. So yeah, so there's in any way, there has to be some kind of critical mass of change, and there have to be people, whatever bodies they're in, men bodies, women's bodies, with different ways of thinking to make a critical mass enough to change the discourse and the thinking.
Thank you. Ilan, you want to finish up?
So, Fred, first of all, thank you for your questions. I mean, they're very, very, touch at the core of this project. So let's begin with the first one. You're right. I mean, at a certain point in the 1970s, we don't have any more Ya'aris in Israeli politics. Ya'ari is gone. Ben Israel, all those, the people that carry with them the legacy of Baruch that talks about, this language trying to, mediate positions of Marx and Zionism. That being said, from the perspective of intellectual history of the ideas, we will all agree that the legacy of this narrative doesn't dissipate into thin air. It morphs quite extensively, but certain political, but again, from the history of the ideas, this element is there. Now, I don't think anybody will argue about that point, and it's true for Israel politics. It's much easier to show in the United States, by the way, much easier. I mean, again, let's talk about the DSA because it's such an easy example. Nobody's going to say that. I mean, again, I have a hard time believing many DSA members read Marx. Okay, they might mention, name drop, but I don't think they read it. That being said, certain ideas perforate this language. And again, I don't think many of them, even either they won't say they're Marxist, or if they'll say, they probably don't know what this really means. But certain elements, are part of that discourse. Now, saying that, and again, the centrality of the separation of church and state in this narrative, this political narrative, is something which I think we will all agree about. And the fact that it's not classical Marxism, but doesn't change anything. It's still a major part of this narrative. Now, to go to your second question, you're absolutely right. In the first chapters of the book, I talk about how they're rejected both by the religious establishment, and I focus on the political establishment of the Aguda in toward Poland, and also the religious left, the left establishment. Now, I would say that in contemporary Israel, I would say not so much the political establishment, but the religious establishment, by maybe the clerical leadership. But I don't think I'll have room in the book to deal with that element. Suffice it to say that I think it's very clear that it's there. And that being said, this religious language is strong enough and has some kind of clerical leadership to tie its knot to. Again, in the case of Meimad, probably the most important ideologue of the movement was Rav Yehuda Amital. Not that he created a lot of religious language, religious texts that talk about the political elements. He was a prolific writer, wrote a lot. His political writings, again, were very, very narrow because his idea of left was focused very much on the political compromise with Palestinians. But that does have some kind of, again, a nucleus to build with.
Okay. Now we might have, Angelique, we have the question from the audience?
Yes, we have a question from Neil Patrick. He was a panelist in one of our other programs. Neil, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, hi, I'm going to assume you can hear me. It's a question for Ilan. You mentioned the possibility, at least, that there could be a reuniting between religious Zionists and what remains of the left in Israel going into the future. I wonder, given the post-67 environment of the expansion of religious nationalism in Israel and the attraction of settling the whole of Eretz Israel, would not the left be still perceived as potentially compromising that territorial reality and even potentially access to some of very revered, even spiritual locations within the whole of Israel?
Well, thank you, Neil. You're obviously right. I mean, the dominant religious political language within the national religious community, which is a Cookian by nature, the legacy of Cook, senior and junior, obviously has a very hard time coinciding with the left. That's true. But it's important to remember that while this is a dominant, maybe the dominant religious political language within the national religious community, it is not the only religious language. So what I'm trying to say is that while you're right that Cookian theology, political theology, doesn't coincide well with the territorial compromise with Palestinians, You can have Orthodox Jews who are not Kupim. And again, that was the case of Netivot Shalom, Oz Shalom, and that was the case of Meimad. And to continue your line of thought, it comes down to one important element we tend to forget, both as historians. I'll beat on my chest as someone who's so interested in history of the ideas. When we focus, and this is something we all need to be very careful about, specifically with history of politics, because we're using these molds, these categories, Marx. In the Department of Philosophy, it's really easy in the sense that it's categorized so easily. But in Realpolitik, well, a little more complicated. Now, so we need to remember that part of the religious language, the religious left, has to do with political expediency and Realpolitik. In other words, Meimad was not only about ideology and religious language, it's also the fact that it looked like there was a chance of a peace process. And the demise of that movement and the demise of the Israeli left, okay, post Ehud Barak, is not only because Ehud Barak was not necessarily the most talented political leader Israel ever saw, also with the fact that he failed miserably. And the Israeli voter said, you know what, it was a nice idea, but it's not working. So that means that a religious voter also has the set of thought. And a religious voter might say, you know what, now Fuchs did say this, but you know what? If I read the newspaper, maybe I need to find a new religious language. And that is how I think that's probably the most accurate explanation I can give this frame of reference.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to. I think we're going to have to, we've more or less run out of time. I'd like to thank both presenters, Professor Friedman and Professor Fuchs, for presenting very interesting papers. And those people that tuned into us, we appreciate your interest in what we talked about today. And I'd like to thank Angelique for all the technical assistance from PSO. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.